6 aircraft. No lights. No radio chatter reaching the outside world. Just the low, steady hum of engines built to disappear from radar, cutting across the dark for 18 straight hours. Inside each one, a weapon that has never been used in combat. 30,000 pounds, 20 feet long. Built for exactly one job, to punch through more than 60 meters of rock and reinforced concrete before it even begins to explode. There is only one aircraft on the planet cleared to carry it. Tonight, that aircraft is flying toward a mountain in Iran. By the time the sun comes up, a facility the world believed was untouchable, buried so deep that engineers called it immune, will have taken a direct hit from a weapon most people have never heard of, carried by a plane that costs more than $2 billion, dropped by a crew that trained for this exact mission and never expected to fly for real. This is the story of how one bomb and one bomber became the only combination on Earth capable of reaching a target everyone else had given up on. To understand why this weapon exists, you have to go back to a problem that had been quietly terrifying military planners for over 2 decades. Since the early 2000s, adversarial states had figured out something simple but devastating. If you can't stop a bomb from hitting your facility, you can stop it from reaching your facility at all. Bury it, not under a few feet of dirt, but under a mountain. Pour hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete around it. Build access tunnels that snake for miles. Put it somewhere no missile, no smart bomb, nothing in the existing arsenal could physically reach. It worked. For years, it worked. Iran's Fordow enrichment facility was the textbook example. Carved into a mountainside near the holy city of Qom, its centrifuge halls sat under roughly 90 meters, nearly the height of a 30-story building of solid rock. Israeli intelligence had tracked the site for years. Analysts studied satellite images, modeled blast dynamics, ran the numbers again and again. And the conclusion kept coming back the same. Nothing in Israel's arsenal, and almost nothing in anyone's arsenal, could crack it open. But that wasn't just an Iran problem. North Korea was doing the same thing with its weapons programs, tunneling command centers into mountains near the Chinese border. So was Russia, hardening key facilities under the same principle. If depth defeats explosives, go deeper. The Pentagon had a name for this quietly growing crisis, the hard and deeply buried target problem. And by the mid-2000s, it had become one of the most urgent, unsolved equations in modern warfare. Here's what almost nobody knew at the time. The U.S. had already started building the answer. Quietly, without fanfare. And the weapon that came out of that program would sit and use for nearly 2 decades, waiting for a moment exactly like the one that was coming. In November 2004, the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory signed a contract worth $30 million with Boeing. The assignment sounded almost absurd on paper. Build the largest, heaviest precision-guided bomb the country had ever fielded, a weapon so specialized it would likely never be used. But that had to work perfectly the one time it might be. They called it the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Inside the program, and eventually in headlines around the world, it became known simply as the MOP. Picture something the length of a school bus, just over 20 feet, and weighing close to 30,000 pounds. More than 10 times heavier than the bunker buster it was replacing. Its casing wasn't ordinary steel. Engineers used a specialized high-density alloy, strong enough to survive the violence of smashing through solid rock at hundreds of miles an hour without cracking apart before detonation. Because if the casing failed even a few feet too early, the entire weapon would be wasted. Here's the part that made it genuinely different from anything before it. Most bombs are dumb weight. Gravity does the work, and a small guidance kit nudges them toward target. The MOP had to do something almost paradoxical. Fall with enough controlled precision to hit within feet of an aim point, then convert all of that kinetic energy into raw penetrating force, drilling downward through layer after layer of rock and concrete. All while an internal sensor silently counted how many barriers it had already smashed through. That sensor is the quiet genius of the weapon. Engineers built what's called a void-sensing fuse. As the bomb tunnels downward, it can actually detect when it punches through open space, a tunnel, a chamber, a room, and count those voids. Program it correctly, and the bomb can be told, don't explode on the first empty space you find. Don't explode on the second. Wait until you've passed through the third chamber, because that's where the target actually is. In March 2007, at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, engineers tested an early prototype against a 330-ton steel-reinforced concrete block, 20 feet thick. The results set a record. The bomb drove 19 feet, 3 inches into that wall before it stopped. 19 feet of solid, reinforced concrete, defeated almost completely by a single strike. By 2015, roughly 20 of these weapons had been manufactured and quietly placed into the Air Force's arsenal, based at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Most Americans had never heard the name. Most of the world hadn't either. But building the perfect bomb solved only half the problem. A 30,000-pound weapon is useless if nothing can carry it to the target. And that turned out to be an entirely separate, almost equally difficult problem, one that came down to a single aircraft. Weight and size sound like a simple engineering constraint. In practice, they eliminated almost the entire U.S. Air Force in one stroke. The MOP is so large that it can't be slung under a wing like most guided bombs. The drag and the sheer bulk would be unmanageable. And mounting something that size externally would instantly destroy the stealth profile of any aircraft trying to sneak it into contested airspace. It has to ride inside a weapons bay. And there are only a handful of aircraft in the world with an internal bay physically large enough to hold it. That narrows the list to 2. The B-52 Stratofortress, a bomber whose basic airframe dates back to the 1950s, and the B-2 Spirit, the flying wing stealth bomber that first flew in 1989. On paper, the B-52 was tested and technically cleared to carry the weapon. In practice, it was ruled out for the mission that mattered most. The B-52 is enormous, radar reflective, and about as stealthy as a barn door. Flying it into the kind of heavily defended airspace surrounding a target like Fordow, layered air defenses, radar coverage, surface-to-air missile batteries, would be close to a suicide mission. You can build the most powerful conventional bomb in the world, but if the aircraft carrying it gets shot down 200 miles from the target, none of that matters. That left exactly one aircraft. The B-2 Spirit doesn't look like a traditional bomber, and that's the point. It has no tail, no distinct fuselage, no sharp angles for radar to bounce off, just a smooth 172-foot flying wing coated in radar-absorbent material. Designed from first principles in the 1980s to be functionally invisible to the air defense systems of the era and remarkably effective against many of today's as well. It carries a crew of just 2. It can fly intercontinental missions without landing, refueling in midair from tankers so it never has to touch down on foreign soil. And buried in its 2 internal weapons bays, the only part of the aircraft built to conceal a payload from radar, there's just enough room for 2 massive ordnance penetrators, one in each bay. Roughly 60,000 pounds of bombs slung inside an aircraft that cost north of $2 billion to build. Only 21 B-2s were ever produced. Only 19 remain in service today. Every single one is based at Whiteman Air Force Base, the same base, not coincidentally, where the MOP itself is stored. For nearly 2 decades, that combination sat ready and unused. The bomb existed. The aircraft existed. The training existed. What didn't exist, yet was a target that finally forced the question of whether it would ever actually be needed. That question got answered in June 2025. By the spring of 2025, Fordow had become the most consequential unsolved target in the world. Israel had spent weeks striking Iranian air defenses, missile production sites, and above-ground nuclear infrastructure. But Fordow, buried under that mountain, remained essentially untouched. Israeli officials had said publicly for years that they lacked a weapon capable of reaching it. Only one country did. On the night of June 21st into June 22nd, 7 B-2 Spirit bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. It was the start of what the Pentagon would later call Operation Midnight Hammer. And for the crews inside those cockpits, it meant roughly 18 hours in the air, much of it in radio silence, flying a route that would eventually funnel them toward one of the most heavily defended patches of airspace on the planet. Here's what most people watching the news that week never fully grasped. This wasn't just 7 planes flying toward Iran. It was a deception and support operation involving more than 125 aircraft in total. Fighters running ahead to sweep for threats. Tankers stretched across the flight path to keep the bombers fueled for a mission longer than most transatlantic flights, and a submarine positioned to fire cruise missiles at supporting targets. All coordinated so that by the time the B-2s reached Iranian airspace, the actual strike would look almost anticlimactic compared to everything that had to happen just to get them there. 6 of the 7 B-2s pushed toward Fordow. The 7th peeled off toward Natanz, another enrichment site with its own underground centrifuge halls. Inside the cockpits, the crews had trained for exactly this scenario: release altitude, release timing, sequencing the drops so that each successive MOP would strike close enough to the crater from the one before it, letting the weapons effectively dig deeper together rather than each starting fresh. It's a technique nicknamed, informally, walking the bombs, using the first impact to weaken the rock and concrete, then sending the next one down almost the same path to drive even further before detonating. At Fordow, 12 massive ordnance penetrators were released. At Natanz, 2 more. And then came the part that no satellite image or press conference could fully answer for days. Did it actually work? In the hours after the strike, the answer wasn't obvious. Underground damage doesn't announce itself the way a leveled building does. Analysts pored over before and after satellite imagery looking for surface disturbance, ventilation shaft damage, collapsed access roads, changes in dust and debris patterns. Try to infer what had happened dozens of meters below ground from photographs of the surface above it. Initial assessments were cautious, even contradictory. Some early intelligence suggested the strike had set Iran's program back by months rather than years. Iranian officials, for their part, downplayed the damage publicly. And for a moment, it looked like even the most powerful conventional weapon in the American arsenal might not have been enough. But that wasn't the full story either. Later analysis, drawing on more detailed satellite passes, structural assessments, and intelligence gathered in the weeks that followed, painted a more serious picture. The void-sensing fuse technology, the feature that let the bomb count chambers as it tunneled downward, appear to have functioned largely as designed at Fordow, driving through the mountain and detonating deep inside rather than near the surface. Multiple penetrators walked into overlapping impact points, had compounded the damage far beyond what a single strike could achieve. What's genuinely uncertain, and worth being honest about, is the precise, long-term extent of the damage to Iran's centrifuge capability. Assessments from different intelligence agencies diverged in the weeks after the strike, and the full picture likely won't be public for years, if ever. What is confirmed without dispute is this: it was the first time in history the GBU-57 had been used in actual combat, and the first time anyone had tested, in real conditions rather than a controlled range, whether a conventional weapon could meaningfully reach a target buried under a mountain. Here's the detail that puts the whole mission in perspective. Every part of Operation Midnight Hammer, the 18-hour flight, the refueling, the decoys, the walked bomb sequencing, existed to solve one narrow engineering problem: getting 30,000-pound weapons close enough, at the right angle, with enough precision to a target that had been considered functionally unreachable. It wasn't overkill. It was the minimum required to make the physics work. Here's the strategic reality that the strike on Fordow exposed, and it goes well beyond one facility in Iran. For years, the doctrine of burying critical infrastructure under mountains rested on a simple assumption: depth is defense. If you go deep enough, no one can touch you, regardless of how sophisticated their air force is. That assumption held for decades, largely because no country outside the U.S. possessed both the bomb and the platform required to disprove it. Operation Midnight Hammer didn't just damage one Iranian facility. It field-tested publicly, unmistakably, the idea that depth alone is no longer an absolute guarantee of safety, at least against a country willing to fly a stealth bomber for 18 hours to prove the point. That has ripple effects far beyond Tehran. North Korea's underground weapons facilities, dug into mountains for the exact same reasons Iran chose Fordow, now sit under the shadow of a demonstrated capability rather than a theoretical one. Any state relying on buried infrastructure to insulate itself from conventional strikes has to reckon with the fact that this is no longer a hypothetical scenario in a Pentagon briefing document. It's a mission that has actually been flown, at night, successfully against one of the hardest targets on the planet. At the same time, the mission exposed just how narrow America's capability actually is. There are 19 B-2s in the world. There is a finite, closely guarded stockpile of GBU-57s. This isn't a weapon that can be scaled up overnight or exported to allies. Israel, despite years of urging the U.S. to share the technology, still doesn't have a platform capable of carrying it. The capability that neutralized Fordow rests on a genuinely tiny footprint, a small fleet of aircraft built in the 1990s, and a bomb stockpile numbering in the dozens. Based at a single airfield in Missouri. That's a strength and a vulnerability at the same time. A strength because it means very few adversaries can replicate it, and none currently can. A vulnerability because the entire capability is concentrated in one narrow, identifiable point, which is exactly the kind of single point of failure that military planners lose sleep over. The successor to the B-2, the B-21 Raider, is already being built with this exact mission in mind, designed from the outset to be able to carry the next generation of deep penetration weapons, expanding a capability that today rests almost entirely on 19 aging airframes and a small, quietly maintained stockpile of bombs most people had never heard of until the night they were finally used. So here's where this story actually leaves us. For nearly 20 years, a bomb sat in storage at a single Air Force base in Missouri, built for a mission its designers weren't even sure would ever happen. An aircraft older than most of its own pilots sat ready alongside it, one of only 19 in existence. Purpose-built to be the single vehicle capable of delivering that weapon into the world's most heavily defended airspace. And then, on one night in June 2025, that theoretical capability stopped being theoretical. What makes this story genuinely remarkable isn't just the size of the bomb or the stealth of the plane. It's the sheer narrowness of the whole equation. Out of thousands of aircraft in the U.S. military, exactly one type can do this job. Out of an entire arsenal of precision weapons, exactly one bomb was engineered specifically to solve this exact problem. 2 decades of quiet engineering, converging on a single mission that lasted less than an hour, over a mountain most people couldn't have located on a map a year earlier. It raises a question that goes beyond Iran, beyond Fordow, beyond any single strike. In a world where more and more critical infrastructure is being buried, hardened, and hidden underground, how long does unreachable actually last? Fordow was supposed to be the answer to that question. For now, at least, it isn't anymore. That's the story of the only plane on Earth that can drop this bomb, and the mountain that finally found out what it was built to do. If you found this breakdown valuable, let me know in the comments what you'd want covered next. Hit like if this kind of deep dive is what you come here for. And subscribe if you want more of these stories explained properly, from the engineering all the way up to the strategy.